Hello and welcome to Orkney Viking Week and this talk on Thorfinn the Mighty with me, Rognvald, from the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute. It's customary to introduce the speaker, but I haven't asked anybody to introduce. I'll just say a little word about myself. As I said, I'm from the Archaeology Institute at UHI and also one of the organizers of this Orkney Viking Week, which is actually a 10-day event with talks and tours and practical workshops and events. We're having so much fun. We're a little over halfway through and it lasts until Sunday the 19th. This talk on Thorfinn the Mighty is one that I wrote for an event in 2019 called the Saga Seminar that was held in St. Magnus Cathedral. The occasion was the launch of a new translation of Flateyjar book. But I thought there was scope to repeat that talk online as well, because not everybody was able to make it to the cathedral in 2019. So here we go. Thorfinn the Mighty. Just need to go up to the top and slideshow from beginning. I can't see the chat function while I'm sharing my screen, but I'll look back at the chat later on. So if you put any questions or comment in the chat, I'll see it at the very end, okay? I've called this talk Thorfinn the Mighty, saga hero, historical figure, and human, because those are the three aspects of Thorfinn that I want to focus on. His proper name is Thorfinnr Inriki Sigurdsson. But if you translate Inriki, it means the mighty, Thorfinn Sigurdsson the Mighty, Earl of Orkney. The saga describes him like this. He was unusually tall and strong, an ugly looking man with a black head of hair, sharp features, a big nose and bushy eyebrows, a forceful man, greedy for fame and fortune. He did well in battle, for he was both a good tactician and full of courage. So I'm sure we all have a mental picture of him now and what he looks like. But who was this man? Dorothy Dunnett, the novelist, has the idea that Thorfinn and Macbeth are one and the same. I'll not go into that now, but just having that idea, I think it says a lot about his character. I'm gonna leave that to one side and explore three aspects of Thorfinn as we see him in the Orkneyinga saga, and that is as a hero, as a historical figure, and as a human. So who was this Thorfinn? He had a long and prosperous life. He was Earl of Orkney for 70 winters, it says in the saga. Although if you try to work out the historical chronology, it seems to be some years shorter. He seems to have been born around 1009 AD or maybe a few years earlier, and then died around 1064 or thereabouts. He was Earl not just of Orkney, but also large areas in Scotland, Western Isles as well. After his death, his life was summed up in the saga like this, that the inhabitants of the lands that he'd held by birthright thought him the greatest earl there ever was, but those who belonged to the lands that he'd taken by force were not as fond of him. They thought his rule was oppressive and were glad to seek help instead from their native chiefs. So if we go back to Thorfinn's youth first, then his story is one of finding his own place between two mighty powers at either side of him. So we've got the King of Norway to the east, and his own grandfather, the King of Scots, to the south. But already in his youth, and even more as he grows up, Thorfinn's story is a story of ambition, of independence, and of resisting the power that those two mighty kingdoms are trying to impose on him, and instead asserting his own power. In 1014, his father died, and little Thorfinn, 5 winters old, was sent off to live with his maternal grandfather, Malcolm, King of Scots. So he grew up in the Scottish court. This is maybe something that people don't think about. Now, when we talk about Thorfinn the Mighty, we always talk about him as an Earl of Orkney, but actually he didn't live in Orkney for most of his childhood, and his young adulthood was all spent outside of Orkney. Yeah, he grew up in the Scottish court, and I have often wondered if it was this that set Thorfinn apart from his older half-brothers. Thorfinn had a different mother to the rest of his brothers. His half-brothers Sumalidi, Brusi, and Einar were Norse and grew up in Orkney, whereas Thorfinn's mother was the King of Scots' daughter, and growing up at Malcolm's court would have made Thorfinn not only a fluent speaker of Gaelic was probably his strongest language, I would guess, and fully bicultural and bilingual, but also it made him fully trained in all the skills that a king needs. And that's presumably where Thorfinn the human picked up his ambition to be like a king. He's got the title of Earl, but he looks up to the role model of the king. Meanwhile, his 3 older brothers, half-brothers, divided Orkney in 3 parts between them. Oh no, I'm a bit soon with my slides here. Yeah, they divided Orkney in 3 parts, 3/3. And especially one of these slices is destined to go on to cause a lot of trouble in the family for many years to come. And little Thorfinn gets no share of Orkney initially. Instead, he was given the title of Earl and Caithness to rule, Caithness up here, by his grandfather, King Malcolm. And he went on to live more than half of his life in Caithness. Only later in adult life, as I said, did he set up a permanent residence in Orkney. And I think it was a strategic move of Malcolm to give his daughter marriage to Thorfinn's father, Sigurd the Stout, because Orkney was a Norse power base up here. Orkney, Shetland, Caithness, Sutherland, down the coast to the Western Isles, all that together was a Norse power base on Malcolm's doorstep. So it was strategic to make sure that it was his grandson who held Caithness and created a buffer zone between the Norse and the Scots while retaining a certain degree of control. So young Thorfinn, the consequence for him is that he's caught between 2 kingdoms. Kingdom of Norway at this point is still young, it's finding its feet. It was in political and religious turmoil with successive kings trying to unify Norway as one kingdom, and then also convert the rulers and the population to Christianity. And here along comes Knut the Great, known in English as Canute, of Denmark and England, and tries to conquer Norway and rule there as well. Resisting him was King Olaf Haraldsson, who was later canonized as Saint Olaf. And into this political turmoil enters young Thorfinn, 11 years old, according to the saga chronology. Otherwise might be in his early teens, but very, very young. still a child, but clearly with a streak of independence and ambition. So Thorfinn is in Norway, and King Olaf puts great pressure on Thorfinn to swear allegiance to him. But Thorfinn explains that the King of Scots already has his allegiance, and asks, could he have time to travel home and consult with his advisors? If I was 11, I would need to speak to some adults too at this point, I think. But Olaf wants an answer immediately and extracts Thorfinn's promise. But he's sensing correctly that that promise is not sincerely meant by Thorfinn, and that Thorfinn will go on to do his own thing anyway. So to subdue Thorfinn, Olaf does a political trick, and that involves that fateful third of Orkney. He declares himself as the overlord of Orkney. So traditionally, Norway's rule over Orkney has been very nominal, that the Earls of Orkney have ruled in Orkney more or less like kings and just done what they please. But now Olaf declares himself as the overlord of Orkney, and that he'll take direct control over 1/3. And he gives Thorfinn 1/3 and his brother Brusi 1/3. His brother Sumarlidi had died by then, and what about Einar, the third brother? Well, the king keeps Einar's 1/3 of Orkney for himself. That's that one. As compensation, he says, for Einar having killed one of his henchmen. And then declares that this 1/3 is under the king's direct control and to do with as he wishes. And then Thorfinn goes home, goes back, and the king speaks to Brusi separately and makes him the king's agent in the Isles, so that effectively Brusi rules 2/3 of Orkney and Thorfinn only 1/3. And when Thorfinn hears this, he's not happy. He's saying it should be half and half. Another sign that Thorfinn doesn't want the Earls of Orkney to be subservient to the king. But at this point, a new player enters the story, and that is 10-year-old Rognvald, the son of Brusi, who, despite being Thorfinn's nephew, is almost the same age as him. He's maybe a couple of years younger. And Rognvald is very handsome and very gifted. The saga says Rognvald was one of the handsomest of men, with a fine head of golden hair, smooth as silk. At an early age, he grew to be tall and strong, earning a great reputation for his shrewdness and courtesy. Everyone agrees that of all the Earls of Orkney, he was the most popular and gifted. And that's him here in the middle of this picture of the Battle of Stiklestad. I'll come back to that battle in a minute. It's like the saga is trying to set up a contrast between the dark hero Thorfinn and the light hero Rognvald, who's so perfect in every way. Little Rognvald, 10 years old, is left behind in Norway when Brusi goes home as a hostage to ensure Brusi's continued loyalty to King Olaf. So in 11th century Norse society, fostering and hostage taking and even marriage were like 3 sides of the same coin. For those of you who heard Nikolaus Frenzel's talk on Sunday will know about this already. This is something Nikolaus also mentioned. And it's not the first time that this has happened in Thorfinn's family either, because a generation earlier, before Thorfinn was born, his oldest brother, Hundi, was taken as a hostage by a previous Norwegian king. But Hundi died while he was a hostage. So his father Sigurd's loyalty ended when the news of his son's death got back to him. but it seems to be common practice to hold hostages as foster sons to ensure loyalty. Anyway, so little Ronald, 10 years old, ends up growing up as foster son of King Olaf. And this starts extending the tensions that were already beginning to form in the family. The bonds of loyalty are starting to creak. One little boy, Thorfinn, has grown up with the King of Scots, and now here's another little boy in the same family growing up with the King of Norway. So the two kingdoms are pulling the family apart. High political games. So Rognvald will later come back to Thorfinn's story, but for a moment we don't hear of it again for many years, while he learns how to be a diplomat, how to be a military strategist, a politician, a good ruler, quite a charming young man. And by going to these lengths to secure Bruce's loyalty as his main man in Orkney, King Olaf shows that he's frightened of Thorfinn, his ambition, his power. Olaf realizes that Thorfinn has solid support from the King of Scots. And this assistance being so near greatly increased Thorfinn's power in Orkney, observes the saga writer. So Olaf was right in this assessment, for in due course Thorfinn makes his brother Brucey agree to let him, Thorfinn, rule 2/3 of Orkney instead of Brucey. Like that. So the king's part that had gone to Brucey now goes to Thorfinn. But when King Malcolm then dies in 1034, and Thorfinn no longer has Malcolm's support, Thorfinn has to hold his own against Malcolm's successors. So the Orkneyinga saga tells us that King Malcolm's successor was called Karl or Kali Hundason. There's different sources here. Some call him Karl and some call him Kali Hundason. I'll just call him Kali for now. And the identity of this Kali Hundason is a puzzle to historians. Barbara Crawford suggested that the saga got the title right but the name wrong, and that this is in fact Macbeth. So countering Dorothy Dunnett's theory here, that Thorfinn is Macbeth. The Orkney historian William Thompson instead suggested that the title is wrong, but the title is not a king, but Mormer of Moray, Gil Comgain, who came to power in 1032. So that's one option. And then one that I quite like too is Alex Wolff has a theory. And he suggests that Kali Hundason is not a Scottish king or a Scottish nobleman at all, but he's another nephew of Thorfinn's. If Hundi, the little hostage who died with the previous king of Norway, survived long enough to have a son, that son's surname would be Hundason. So maybe this is a half nephew, well, nephew of Thorfinn from his older brother Hundi, presumed dead. Anyway, we don't know who Kali Hundason is. But the conflict between Kali Hundason and Thorfinn starts when Kali bestows the earldom of Caithness on his own nephew Modon. Oh yeah, I forgot to show this picture of Macbeth. Is that a very young Ian McKellen as Macbeth? So that could be our image for Kali here. Yeah, the earldom of Caithness up here, that had been Thorfinn's from when Thorfinn was born. Kali Hundason goes and puts his own nephew Modon in there. So that's a power grab that Thorfinn doesn't like at all, and Thorfinn has to do something. So he chases him through Caithness, through Sutherland, and down to Ross, all the way to the river Oikel, like down here, and reclaims the large area that the first Earl the very first Earl of Orkney, Sigurd the Mighty in legend, is said to have laid under him, and he's said to have been buried in a mound by the River Oikel. So in the saga narrative, Thorfinn's actions come across as heroic. We're meant to see him as a hero at this point, but if we view him as a human, he seems very ruthless, killing men and burning homes as he goes along. Meanwhile, over in Norway, King Olaf is having problems because the Earls of Lade up in Trondheim are supporters of King Knut the Great. And the Earls of Lade are really, really powerful. They are like kings of mid-Norway and the old capital at Nidaros. So, they are in power, and in 1028, they drive Olaf in exile into Russia. So Ronald Bruce's son, the foster son, is now a young adult of around 18 and goes with him. And Ronald loyally stays with Olaf in exile. And on his return to Norway, he stays with him in the attempt to reclaim the kingdom. And that attempt ends in Olaf's death at the Battle of Stiklestad in July 1030. There's an image from the Battle of Stiklestad where Olaf is killed by several people all at once. See, we've got 3 killers here. So that battle is near Trondheim in 1030. One of Olaf's killers is Kalv Arnason. Now that's a problem because that is Thorfinn's wife's uncle. And there's something else about this battle too. The sagas make out that Ronald's fate and King or Saint Olaf's fate are somehow supernaturally connected. You can't get all of this from Orkneyinga saga, but if you read Saint Olaf's saga and Orkneyinga saga together, you notice that shortly before the battle, there's a story where Ronald remarks that Olaf has made a slip of the tongue. And he interprets that as a sign that Olaf's days are numbered. So they're on the way to the battlefield, and Olaf stops to pick some berries and eats them. And he says, "That's not much berries." And Ronald says, "Oh, that's a slip of the tongue. What do you mean to say? That's not much of an army, because here they come." Because berries in Norwegian is bær and army is her, so it's almost the same word, just one letter difference. Anyway, a slip of the tongue was taken as a sign of being fey or being destined to die. So it's like your mind is saying something that your conscious mind is not aware of, and that was taken as a sign from fate. And then they all know that Olaf's days are numbered, and he goes on to die in the battle. But 15 years later, Rognvald having survived, it's Rognvald's turn to do the same in a prelude to Thorfinn's burning of Rognvald on Papa Stronsi. That's also preluded by a slip of the tongue. I'll come back to that, but just for now, Rognvald survives the Battle of Stiklestad, and he saves the life of Olaf's half-brother, younger half-brother Harald, later known as Harald the Hard Ruler, who lost the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Anyway, he hides with Harald in Sweden and in Russia until 1034, where he receives news that his father Brusi has died, which prompts him to finally return to Orkney and claim his father's share of the earldom here. So Ronald, remember, he was gifted, he was educated, he was very well connected, and particularly he enjoyed the full support of Magnus, the son of King Olaf. He was like a brother to him. Age 10, Magnus had been brought back to Norway and installed as king by Ronald. and some Norwegian noblemen, including Olaf's killer, Kalv Arneson, who had switched allegiance by now. So now with his silver tongue, Ronald managed to claim the contested third of Orkney by saying that Magnus had the odal right to it and the right to bestow it. So Ronald is trying to claim Bruce's third and the contested third. And Thorfinn, he couldn't do anything about this because he was busy fighting off Kali Hundason down in Caithness, Sutherland. So he just agrees as long as Ronald promises to help him out. Thorfinn might have seen Ronald as his deputy here, whereas Ronald definitely saw himself as holding a third of Orkney by birthright and a further third on behalf of King Magnus. But Thorfinn, as we know, refuses to be subservient to any king, so he does not acknowledge King Magnus's right to bestow any part of Orkney on anyone, nor does he regard the Earl of Orkney as a deputy for the King of Norway, not even within the contested third. Could the person called Fire Tablet please mute their microphone, please? Thank you. Okay, so at this point, there's a story that we don't get to hear in the Orkneyinga saga. And that is one that we have to read between the lines and piece together from several sagas, and that's the story of Thorfinn's wife, Ingebjörg. I've chosen the picture of the runic inscription from Mesa here where it says Ingebjörg, but I couldn't find any definite illustrations of her, but that might be her here next to Malcolm Canmore, her second husband. Ingebjörg, who was she? Thorfinn's wife. And the internal fault lines that run through her family. Well, she was from a very powerful family up in Trøndelag in mid-Norway. She was from a family called the Arnmodlinger. They were top-notch Norwegian nobility. And Ingebjörg's father, Finn Arneson, was a close ally of King Olaf. But Finn's brother, Kalv, Ingebjörg's uncle, that was one of Olaf's killers. So Kalv, Ingebjörg's uncle, creates discord in the family, first with his killing of Olaf, and then changing political allegiances, switching over to support young Magnus. The hagiographical stories of St. Olaf portray Kalv as a turncoat and a traitor. Snorri Sturlason, who wrote the saga of the Norwegian kings in the 13th century, had a bit more sympathy for why Kalv switched allegiance twice from Olaf to King Knut and then back again to Olaf's son Magnus. But my question is, how does this influence Thorfinn and his family? Was Kalv Arneson a wedge between Rognvald and Thorfinn? Potentially also between Thorfinn and his wife, Ingebjörg. The Orkneyinga saga gives a rather strange account of this. It says that after Thorfinn and Ronald had shared Orkney and worked together for 8 to 10 years, Kalv suddenly turns up to Thorfinn's home in Caithness as a political refugee from Norway. And the Orkneyinga saga doesn't explain what's happened to Kalv. It just says that Kalv had to escape from King Magnus. So potentially he was banished by him after years of being among the young king's advisors. So now that the king is older, it seems Kalv has suddenly fallen out of favor and has to leave the country. And where will he go? Well, he goes to his niece Ingebjörg in Caithness. A poem by the Icelander Bjarni Gullbrå says that evil tongues had undermined Kalv out of envy. So was his reputation as an unreliable turncoat building? Or was it a power grab by his former ally Einar Tambarskjeve? In any case, Kalv is now expelled from court and he's running away. He comes to his niece Ingebjörg, and the fault lines in the family start cracking again. Orkney's saga explains it became difficult for Thorfinn to feed Kalv and all his entourage for such a length of time. And that led him again to think of that third of Orkney that he and his brothers had fought over for so long. King Olaf and King Magnus had tried to claim as their own that contested third. So Thorfinn starts thinking about that. And in the saga, it seems like it's just to raise money, almost like raise supplies that he can use to feed Kalv's entourage. And that leads him to go and demand that share back from Rognvald. But I think there's more to it than that. I speculate that Thorfinn also has vast areas in Caithness, Sutherland, Hebrides to collect taxes from. Can he not feed Kalv and his entourage? Does he need that third of Orkney? I think there's something the saga is not telling us here. While Kalv is there, what is he saying? Is he whispering things about Ronald's closeness to his foster brother King Magnus? About the king asserting power in Orkney? He's saying something that potentially upsets the fine balance between Thorfinn and the King of Norway and the King of Scots. That Thorfinn has tried to strike without being subservient to either of them. Is Kalv saying that Ronald is upsetting that balance? Is that why he wants to assert his right to that third again? So Thorfinn and Ronald, once close allies, turn on each other and become each other's deadly enemy. They fight a sea battle at Robery in South Ronaldsea. And the poet Arnor, who liked both, comments about that. Awkward or choice. When earls are eager to fight, friendship is far from easy. So the Kalv, the turncoat, is the turning peg of the story. Having first relied on Thorfinn's protection, Ronald passes Kalv a message from King Magnus saying, you can have your estates in Norway back and the right to live there, but only if you back Ronald in the Battle of Robery. So Kalv is not sure what to do. He's initially neutral in the battle. And then Thorfinn warns him how history will judge him. Kalv must have realized that his reputation as a turncoat was becoming a bit of a problem. So he joins the fighting on Thorfinn's side. And that is the turning point in the battle where Thorfinn comes out victorious and at last rules all of Orkney. The fatal thirds reunited and Ronald flees. First to King Magnus in Norway. Thorfinn moves to Orkney to set up a permanent residence in Orkney in Bershi. What does Ronald do then? Well, he could return with another army, but instead of doing that, he comes to Orkney in secret on a single ship. He launches a surprise attack on Thorfinn and sets fire to his house. And like a superhero, Thorfinn, the saga hero, takes Ingebjörg, his wife, in his arms, kicks down a wall and escapes from the burning house with her under the cover of smoke. And they hide out in Caithness until Ronald thinks that Thorfinn is dead. And then, just before Christmas, here comes the slip of the tongue and how the fates of St. Olaf and Ronald are supernaturally connected. Just before Christmas, Thorfinn gives Ronald a taste of his own medicine. So Ronald wants to celebrate Christmas by brewing a lot of beer, and he thinks, who has the best malt? Well, the monks at Papa Stronsi do. So he goes over to Papa Stronsi to get malt. And now the web of fate closes in of him, because this is where Ronald makes a slip of the tongue. He sits in somebody's house there, warming himself by the hearth, and Ronald says, when this fire is burnt out, we shall have lived long enough. Oh, he meant to say, warmed ourselves long enough. And then realizing what's happened, he concludes, maybe Uncle Thorfinn is not dead after all. He's alive. And in fact, he is. He's at this very moment surrounded the building with burning torches. And so Thorfinn ends up as the unrivaled ruler and sole survivor in his family after fighting off all the competitions from his closest relatives, all his half-brothers and his nephew, which is a great outcome for the saga hero, but strikes me as a sad outcome for Thorfinn the ruler, having to kill off your family like that. At the height of his power, the saga describes Thorfinn's realm as consisting of all of Orkney and Shetland with it, and 9 Scottish earldoms, it says. Hebrides, a part of Ireland besides, in some a considerable realm, which Thorfinn rules like as if it were a kingdom. So he's now in a position to put his political opposition to the kings of his neighboring country aside and rise above it. He does that by going to visit the new king of Norway, King Magnus's uncle, Harald Hardrade, and is at last reconciled with him. And he also pays visits to all the other neighboring kings. He goes to Denmark, to England. He meets with Emperor Heinrich in Saxland, and even travels all the way to Rome to see the Pope. So late in life, Thorfinn shows himself as a statesman. Oh yeah, I forgot to say something about that picture. That's the remains of the church that Ronald built to honor his foster father Olaf in Kirkwall. But here's Thorfinn's achievement late in life when he showed himself as a statesman. Barbara Crawford calls him the first medieval ruler of Orkney, as opposed to a Viking ruler, ending the Viking age, establishing a rule in Orkney that brings it in line with what medieval kings are doing elsewhere in Europe, such as aligning the law to laws elsewhere. It says in the saga that he laid down a new law, but as Nicolaus told us in his talk, we don't know what that law contained because it's not preserved, but it's very likely to be aligning it with other laws and including a Christian section in it, establishing days of feasts and fast and saints' days and so on. He also established a bishopric and built the first cathedral, installed the bishop in it, Christ Church in Bercy. So Thorfinn lived out his life unrivaled and was buried at Christ Church, where later his grandson, Saint Magnus, also found his first resting place. So Thorfinn, the historical figure, constituted the historical horizon for the writer of the Orkney saga, the first person that the writer had any detailed knowledge about. Anybody before Thorfinn in the saga, we only get very short information about, and it seemed more like legend, whereas Thorfinn is the first person the saga writer has quite a lot of detailed information on. And so that's Thorfinn, the historical figure. Thorfinn, the saga hero, treats us to some dramatic and memorable scenes, especially kicking down the wall and escaping with Ingebjörg in his arms. That always sticks with me. And that tells us something about how he was remembered, even if they are perhaps not all accurate. But Thorfinn the human, I'm still curious about, this 5-year-old who grew up away from his parents in a court where he learned to yearn for a kingdom, and a teenager who must be a man, and the man who overcame and killed all of his closest family, and the old man whose legacy was as a true Christian and a great statesman and one of the greatest earls that Orkney has ever known. Thank you. Let's open for questions now. Now I can see the chat again. Okay, there's nothing in the chat, so you're welcome to type in there or else unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions or comment. What happened to Kalv is Lexi's question. I wish I could answer that one. I should be able to answer that one, shouldn't I? But I'll have to read Snorri's saga again and pay more close attention to Kalv to find out what happened to him at the end of his life. I've just looked him up. It says that he spends his life in exile in Hebrides, Ireland, Denmark, seems to travel a lot around and live here and there. That was Colm. Okay, if there are no questions, I'll end with saying that tomorrow we're having a talk by Lexi Cunningham, is her pen name, who writes the Orkney Murders series. So she bases her murder mystery books on historical events like these, and are informed by Orkney's history and archaeology. So I'm really looking forward tomorrow evening to hear from Lexi. And if you want to come to Orkney Murders tomorrow evening, go to the Viking Festival program on broadgar.co.uk/Viking Week, and then click there to register on Eventbrite, and it'll send you the link. Carol Brooks is asking, who do I favor for Macbeth? Oh, I really couldn't say. I think Kali Hundason is quite a shadowy figure that we don't know enough about to say for sure whether or not this is a historical person, and if he is, whether he's Macbeth or not, that's just impossible to tell from the saga. I think Dorothy Dunnett builds her case quite well in her novel. She has an argument that if Thorfinn's mother, this Scottish princess, had a Scottish name that could cause him to be known as the son of Macbeth. Macbeth could be Thorfinn's Gaelic name, whereas Thorfinn Sigurdarson is his Norse name, and having a Gaelic name and a Norse name and be known by both is entirely possible. So I think she argues quite well in her novel, but historians don't really engage so much with her novel, so it's not been scrutinized academically so much, but it's out there as a very intriguing suggestion. Angela says, I read Dorothy Dunnett's King Hereafter years ago, and so came to Orkney already Thorfinn the Mighty's biggest fan. That's great, Angela. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.